So the way we set up the panels for today is that this first panel, we want to sort of set the background, thinking about the ways in which higher education institutions engage as international actors. And we've asked a set of specialists to come today and join us. And as I mentioned earlier, we are seeing a rapid evolution of the way in which higher education is evolving in terms of the way in which they engage internationally in a substantive way, not just in terms of the ways in which they facilitate educational exchanges, but also the way in which they're reaching out in other countries and creating outposts for research, teaching, and service-related opportunities. And so we've asked these folks to come in and really provide what their thoughts on where are the critical questions in terms of thinking about higher education as international actors. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Katie. Katie is the Director of Cross-Border and International Research at the Buffalo Regional Institute, Katie Friedman, and she's going to be talking about legitimacy in higher education and cross-border and international relations. Katie?
All right, thank you. Thank you, Jason. And I'd actually like to thank can you guys hear me? I'd like to thank the organizing committee for inviting me to participate in this morning's colloquium. I believe that this is a timely event for two reasons. First, in my view, U.S. higher education is really reaching something of a watershed. I look forward to hearing from my international education colleagues and hearing more from them on some of the changes that are taking place in higher education and the internationalization of higher education. But to me, sitting in the trenches at the University of Buffalo at the Regional Institute, it really appears to me that higher education is facing some challenges that are in part caused by globalization and internationalization, but also I see internationalization as presenting some possible solutions to those challenges. So I really look forward to being educated more by my colleagues here today. I am a researcher trained in international relations and international law. And in my view, I think that it really is time to re-examine, redefine, and re-identify the boundaries and the contents of the field in a conceptually coherent way, to me, a way that really reflects reality. To me, the distinction between domestic and international and local and global are no longer relevant. I also believe that traditional concepts such as trade, we heard about higher education as an export and an import. To me, that's a radical concept. Someone who is trained in international political economy and trade never heard higher education exports and imports within the context of international trade. So I think there are some key concepts that need to be placed under scrutiny and re-examined and re-identified. I'm just going to take 2 minutes for those of you who may not be familiar with international relations. I'm going to take 2 minutes and give you a short primer on the kinds of actors that actually participate in international relations. And I'm not exactly sure where I'm supposed to point this. Let's see. Maybe? Should I? Yep. Just like that? Okay. I'll do it for you. Okay. Okay. Do you want to click now then? Okay. For those of you who, again, aren't international relations specialists, you have to recognize that not everyone would agree that international education or higher education institutions are, in fact, actors in international relations. One of the perennial issues for international relations researchers is our focus of attention, right? And for some scholars, nation states are it. These are the realists, the neo-realists. They believe that nation states are the primary legitimate actor in international relations. Now, the good news for us is that we've been hearing about the demise of the nation state for almost as long as we have been studying the nation state. And so where a number of different bodies of literature have emerged that really capture non-state actors. And for me, one of the best lenses through which to view international relations and try to get a handle on it is really this body of work referred to either as transnational networks or transgovernmental networks. This is the work of folks like Jessup in international law, or Cohen and Nye, or actually more recently Anne-Marie Slaughter, who just left the State Department. Each of these scholars has written extensively on transnational networks and transgovernmental networks. Even though each takes a different view on this web of relationships, they all view the world in terms of the broad interconnections that are formed by subcomponents of nation states. So these non-state actors that comprise these transnational networks are multinational corporations, NGOs, terrorist organizations, right? Sort of the dark side of globalization. Philanthropic, super empowered individuals like George Soros and Bill Gates are seen as critical to transnational networks. And again, in my view, and hopefully the view of many of you who are here today, higher education institutions, I think fit quite nicely as actors using this transgovernmental or transnational relations lens. Would you click it, please? Okay. So if we argue that higher education institutions are actors, for me, the next question is, are they legitimate? Are these legitimate actors on the international scene? And as was referenced several times in the opening remarks, there are a number of traditional measures or traditional ways to capture the legitimacy or the influence of higher education on the global stage. You can look at student and faculty exchanges, area studies, look at different international elements of curriculum across universities, foreign languages, and actually looking at economic impact of internationalization at home campuses. Would you click it, please? And just to demonstrate that these types of measures can be quantified, and there is empirical evidence to support it. SUNY has undertaken some of this research. They did come up with metrics for measuring how internationalized SUNY is, and that was actually led by our vice provost, or co-led by our vice provost for international education, Stephen Dunnett. And SUNY found that there's a profound impact, right, across New York State with regard to international students, international scholarships, the economic impact of students, and the economic impact of international research on New York State. Would you click it, please? Thank you. But then the question for me becomes, are they legitimate sources of power in international relations? What role does higher education play in global politics? How accountable are higher education institutions? To whom is higher education accountable? Do higher education institutions change the way that government acts when conflicts of interest arise between governments or among governments? To me, the next question is really, really critical. Can higher education change principles and norms, right? So to me, I think we need to think a little bit more outside of the box, build upon some of these traditional measures that are used to demonstrate the legitimacy of higher education as actors in international relations, but think perhaps a little bit more broadly, and measure legitimacy and influence, perhaps, for example, by looking at the nature of global connections, and not just higher education connections to each other, strategic partnerships and bilateral relationships, but also looking at strategic global connections among higher education and business and government. I think that looking at the economic impact of some of these campuses in foreign countries would be extremely eye-opening. We know what the economic impact is, again, for example, in New York State, but what about the economic impact of where some of these campuses are located across the world? Looking at dollars, people, and other resources applied to problem-solving engagement in foreign countries. For example, the Center for International Development, looking at how its work might actually be a legitimate source of power for higher education. Looking at the impact on student perceptions, Bob Gasende discussed some of the, you can't quantify this stuff, right? But we all intuitively know it. But looking at student perceptions and then political elites, business elites in other countries, and looking at how higher education and ideas have really changed perspectives and perceptions. I mean, maybe it's a series of interviews, looking at the stories that these people have to tell, and then, drawing out some broad principles or concepts from them. We can talk about a method, but I think that's critically important to demonstrating higher education's legitimacy and relevance as a source of power. And then just this whole idea of epistemic communities. What role do these cross-boundary research networks, these epistemic communities, play, for example, if it's an environmental epistemic community, what role does it actually play in influencing environmental politics? I think these are all really, really interesting areas for us to explore today. Could you, yeah, thank you. Thank you. So then the next question, okay, so I'm building the case, right? I was sort of trained as a lawyer, so I'm building the case. Higher education institutions are actors. They certainly are legitimate. There are legitimate measures. I'm proposing some new measures, but then I think, maybe the $24,000 question is, who cares, right? Why does it matter? Why does it matter to anybody? And to me, I think that it matters because higher education institutions really may be an underutilized tool in the diplomatic toolkit. And other people who are far more well-versed in this area than I, who are going to be talking about soft power and public diplomacy, can really get into the nuts and bolts of this. But I think that if it can be demonstrated through empirical evidence, and again, maybe not so much data, but interviews, storytelling, and the like, that higher education is a legitimate actor influencing power politics on the world stage, that opens up a whole new way for policymakers to think about using higher education in foreign policy. I just have up there, trade opens economies, higher education opens minds. I really do think that, and it's sort of capturing that and laying it out for policymakers that's really important. I just leave you with this quote that I found as I was preparing for today. The field of international relations is currently experiencing a period of great research activity, which some see as growth and others as dismemberment, which some see as intellectually invigorating and others as intellectual pretension, some as socially relevant and others as an escape and social responsibility. Would you click once more, please? Thank you. It's important to note that this is attributed to the Director of External Research in the U.S. Department of State in 1967. To me, I think that this quote is as relevant today as it was 45 years ago. And I look forward to today's colloquium, one that is intellectually invigorating, not pretentious, one that is socially relevant, and one that contributes overall to both fields of international education and international relations, but then has practical relevance to policymakers. Thanks.
Thanks, Katie. As Katie was talking, one of the examples that came to my mind quickly was, and again, in Qatar, thinking about the fact they've imported Northwestern University to actually help Al Jazeera improve itself. I thought, what an interesting example of this sort of way in which higher education is influencing other actors in other countries. So a great example and a great way to think about the furthering of higher education as international actors. We're just going to get Mark's PowerPoint loaded here.
That's what I get for arriving at the last minute.
Yeah. We'll blame it on the cab.
Yes. He got completely lost.
I don't know how you get lost in Albany, but makes me wonder where you're staying, Mark. But as Joe pulls this up for us, just a quick introduction. Mark is a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin, has been studying this very thing, the role of higher education in public diplomacy, particularly the focus on Russia as well. So. We'll turn it over to Mark.
Thank you. And thanks to Jason and all the organizers for your sharing. This is a great opportunity for me. I'll wait to turn the mic on as well. That's it. Perfect. And I have a limited number of slides. This goes on. And this. Great. Thank you. That's very loud. I appreciate the opportunity. To talk to you today. My own background is actually in, this will especially appeal to Bob Gassendi and some others. I was trained as a Sovietologist, and my interest evolved over the years in part because it got to the point where my undergraduates no longer knew what that was. And evolved into the history of education, especially Russian and Soviet education. So the primary focus of my research is actually contemporary post-Soviet or Russian and Eurasian education, especially higher ed. But of course, having been trained and spent many years in that field, I also have 25 years of experience with US government policy in this area, largely because I was funded. I was paid to learn Russian. I was sent to the Soviet Union repeatedly. I benefited repeatedly from both Title VI and Title VIII programs. And it is a source of great concern to me that we basically are seeing the end of that architecture. So what this is a kind of preliminary take with a lot of research questions, a lot of questions posed, a lot of, kind of a quick historical overview that will try to help explain that. And this is one of the things, we know this, we live this. Many of you have pioneered and run these kind of programs for a very long time. So my interest is kind of digging a little deeper and actually beginning to think about what, as Catherine mentioned, an empirical research project would look like that would actually begin to look at this. And I see this as in part, again and again and again, a theme that's going to come up in my comments is that of unintended consequences of academic capitalism and the neoliberal model of university development. And we all, again, know what that is. That is the world we live in, the reality of in SUNY and University of Wisconsin and virtually every other state system. And of course, what this has meant over the last 20, 30, 40 years has a very profound shift in the focus of internationalization. And that has obviously changed the institutional capacity for global engagement. We have wound down certain capacities and developed others, and I'm sort of trying to probe a little what the consequences of that are. The large picture, obviously, is from an earlier focus on foreign languages and area studies, linked to a Cold War framework, first to the Second World War, and then especially to the Cold War. And again, the world we're all a part of now, a more recent focus on business, STEM, the needs of the STEM fields, public-private partnerships, corporate funding for research. We know all this. This is the world that all of us live in. And yet the question remains, kind of the question I'm going to pose is, can this second cluster succeed without the first? If we let the foundations in foreign languages and area studies fade away, or that capacity decline, can we possibly hope that that new, more neoliberal kind of academic capitalist cluster of international activities be successful without those foundations? Okay, now kind of a brief historical overview, and again, some of you know this much better than I. I think, in fact, I did see Nicholas Call, who, the Nicholas Call, who has done exceptional pioneering work about a lot of this. So the intellectual and disciplinary legacies of the missionary kids, or the Mish kids, and again, partly myths and partly realities. I mean, really, truly extraordinary work was done, even if we mythologize it as a golden age. And yet exceptional. A lot of these people were trained, PhDs at some of the best universities in the world, both in Europe and in the United States, and a remarkable rich body of work in the early and middle part of the 20th century in the humanities fields, in languages, history, philosophy, religious studies about other cultures and other parts of the world. One of the kind of myths of that period of time is that there was at least some respect, thus the question mark, for the boundaries between educational and cultural diplomacy, especially in the State Department and around what would become Fulbright, and the information operations people, you know, the kind of PR, propaganda machinery, the truth campaigns. That wasn't, of course, always the case. There were great disparities in funding and in staffing between those, as Professor Cull has written about. And yet I think there was generally that spirit sort of maintained itself. You had some of the leading scholars in the United States, from major university presidents and Ivy League scholars, who would participate in the advisory commissions and in the selection panels for Fulbright programs. I mean, these were the gold standard of this kind of international project. And you really did have, I think, a legitimate kind of spirit of the New Deal and of interwar social democracy carried over into the wartime programs and the planning in the aftermath of the war. And that spirit, the most important thing about that, of course, is the spirit of mutuality as embodied in the very structure and ethos of the Fulbright program. Then, in a sense, you also have another set of myths and realities of the second golden age, 58 with, of course, NDEA into the 60s. And again, this is the world we know this. Madison, I believe that the two largest universities with the largest number of national resource centers, federally funded national resource centers, is UW-Madison and University of Washington. You know, building this tremendous capacity through Title VI, through Fulbright-Hays, foreign language development. We have, for example, one of the broadest array of African languages of anywhere in the world, and of all places, right? And remarkable African studies program. So you also have, in addition to that, and partly I think our understanding of all of this is in part because the funding streams were kind of fragmented and always kind of politically contested and volatile from year to year, but you also had both state and especially AID funds to mobilize US universities into partnerships and technical assistance programs. And yet, stepping back, so that's the kind of myth, right, that this was the golden age of university funding and massive multi-million-dollar AID technical assistance programs. The reality is that despite that impressive growth, you had a relatively small number of US faculty and students actively involved in those kind of programs. And in part, of course, you didn't have strong alumni networks that would lobby for them or lobby for their continuation. Then, of course, we get into the 1970s, and again, you know, I'm sort of breezing through this very quickly. Some of you know this history very well. But the tensions on campuses around the federal programs became very acute. Again, I grew up in Madison and remember myself the bombing of the Math Army Research Center, the bombing of Sterling Hall in 1970. Tremendous conflicts about defense research funding, about ROTC programs. But also, of course, the failure of TVA-style sort of massive infrastructure development, the great TVA on the Mekong project, most notably, about which some brilliant recent historical work has been done. And again, I'm trying to kind of weave this history, especially into the field of comparative and international education. Because you see a real split. On the one hand, you have critiques of modernization theory. You have a whole wave of very radical theories that emerge in the field of CIE, which is comparative and international ed. That, you know, sort of blistering attacks upon the US government, upon the Ford Foundation, upon the Rockefeller Foundation for engaging in cultural imperialism, and it created a real split in the field. And then another critical turning point came with the efforts to, in the Carter administration, to organize what was called the International Communications Agency, which kind of broke down, some analysts think, that firewall between information operations and the educational and cultural programs in a way that the true autonomy, or from some perspectives, the scholarly integrity of the educational cultural side never fully recovered from that attempted reorganization around USICA. And of course, again, this is kind of the world that many of us are very familiar with. Conflicts and the effects of the area studies controversy, you know, the sort of blistering attacks of one side upon the other, the criticism of the old style area studies as lacking in rigor, shift to interdisciplinary international studies. This is the point at which Title VI began to fund international studies programs and global studies programs. And we see the increasing dominance of the hard social sciences, especially quantitative methodologies, over the soft area studies. And that split kind of reinforces these tensions and these fractures. And in a broad shift since that period of time, even though funding went up in the 1980s, there were very complicated choices about where that funding was being invested. Much more of it went into media and global information operations than into more traditional educational and cultural diplomacy. And a broad shift in federal and foundation funding away from US universities and towards private contractors and nonprofit organizations. And of course, many of those contractors would hire university faculty to go and run the programs or participate in the programs, but no longer as direct contracts with, of course, the overhead to large-scale US universities. And the benefit of nonprofits, of course, is that you got much closer to the ground in many of the countries in which these programs were taking place, which was also tremendously valuable. But that didn't necessarily build capacity at the US partner institutions, right? So again, this is mixed. I don't mean to say that this is all black and white. Then, of course, we have some unintended consequences of the end of the Cold War. And it was initially, some of my research was on the Soviet side of this, was on Soviet international development programs, Soviet approaches to development. Much as one of the largest international projects of the United States was the attempt to develop Vietnam, similarly, one of the largest projects of the Soviet Union was the attempt to develop Afghanistan from 1954 until 1989. That ends, of course, right? And we both wind down our investment in the developing world, in education and other exchanges in the developing world. Lumumba University goes through a period of extended crisis in the early 1990s, as I'm sure some of you know. And then, of course, in the 1990s, especially, a shift away from the third world, or the developing world, to a focus on post-communist transition. And so very impressive US government programs were mounted in this period of time, but a really kind of fundamental shift in focus of those projects. The second point kind of raises an important research question, because we see, of course, the emergence of the Washington Consensus and a kind of neoliberal framework in how we conduct ourselves in global education. And of course, the policy turn on the part of the US government and the part of the World Bank and others away from higher education in the 1980s and into the 1990s. And yet, I don't yet think we have a lot of really good empirical evidence about where that package of reforms worked and where it didn't and why, right? We have a sense that, we have a lot of kind of ideological arguments that either it always worked or it never did, but I think it's actually a much more complicated kind of empirical question about where that package actually worked. Then again, we know the shift away from area studies and into business and STEM rationales. That was done in part to sustain congressional funding. And yet, the big picture, to the degree that we have a big picture of all of this, is that even as Title VI and Fulbright-Hays programs expanded and went from 3 or 4 or 5 core programs to 10 or 12, the overall federal funding remained flat or declined, right, relative to the sort of early decades. Then, kind of failed or incomplete reforms in recent years. And again, I don't mean this to sound excessively critical. I know that people have, tremendously talented people have spent enormous amount of time and energy building these programs, doing incredible work. I have seen a lot of these public diplomacy and university partnership programs up close, and I've done evaluations of many of them. Incredible people, incredibly talented people working in very, very, very difficult conditions. In a sense, it's almost more that the political dimension of it and the kind of congressional meddling and the volatility of funding has failed to live up to the potential of the diplomats and the public diplomacy people and the teachers on the ground, frankly. The real heroes are in the field in this story, I think. But we know about the new funding after 9/11. Yet a lot of that was considered very ineffective, especially the outreach programs in the Islamic world. The National Security Language Initiative in 2006, which was funded, I think, at about $118 million in 2007, then dropped to 25 in 2008, and never really lived up to its potential. National Research Council study that essentially attempted to look at the big picture of this over 50 years and basically said there is not enough money. We desperately need more funding for these programs to live up to their potential. I think we all kind of know how that story's about to end. The Study Abroad Foundation never really materialized, despite the fact that the very sophisticated preparatory work that was done, the funding was never allocated. There are more hopeful things recently with the Obama administration's new approach to integrating, sort of revitalizing the role of universities and of public diplomacy in American development strategy. We see this in the QDDR and now in a brand new grant competition that is out from USAID. Called the Higher Education Solutions Network. And this represents a tremendously important shift because AID is basically re-engaging with the major American research universities. So we at Madison were developing 3 potential applications to that in global health, sustainable agriculture, energy, and higher education. Now this is the budget trends. It's not a great slide. It didn't format well. And again, I know some of you are very familiar with this. You see the sharp decline because of the struggle around the federal budget in April of 2011. The Obama administration has proposed that this be continued or slightly increased, and yet that is entirely an open question whether that's going to happen. Right? We could, of course, be seeing the potential demise of Title VI. And the International Institute of Public Policy, a very well-intentioned effort to try to increase the representation of disadvantaged students and minority student populations in international affairs and international education, has been zeroed out. So, to step back from all of this, what is the significance of the trends, and what are the key research questions? We all sort of know that the trend has been away from area studies and foreign languages and towards this kind of new dimension of internationalization around business, professional programs, STEM, and technology transfer. And yet, both parts of that, both the old camp and the new camp, are threatened by federal budget cuts, right? And we are, as I say, depending on the outcomes of the budget discussions in Washington and, frankly, of the elections, we could be seeing the potential end of Title VI and of Title VIII. So then these are the 2 questions. And again, there's a kind of intuitive answer to these, but I guess what I'm interested in working on and would love to hear from other people who are very familiar with some of these issues. Do patterns in federal funding over the last 5, 10, 20, 40 years directly shape trends in student enrollments, majors, and careers? One assumes they do, right? I look at that and I think, yes, well, that's kind of intuitive that they probably do, but we don't know that. We don't actually have empirical data that would show that federal funding invested in a particular national resource center or a national language center directly drives enrollments and faculty capacity and staffing and teaching in the types of courses being offered. And that's going to be a very, very hard thing to prove. You're going to have to really get into the nuts and bolts and do case studies at institutions like Madison or Washington or Indiana or elsewhere, or SUNY that received a lot of this funding. And then, the kind of question I posed at the beginning, can university internationalization succeed without that capacity in area studies and foreign languages? And I would say no, it cannot, right? It'll be impoverished intellectually, culturally, cross-culturally. And yet again, one can make that argument rhetorically. The question is, can we prove it empirically? So I would pose those as open questions for the discussion today. And thank you all.
Great, thanks, Mark. Sorry, folks. I'll stay in the other room. Next up is Dan Whitman. Dan is a faculty member at American University and is a retired Foreign Service officer. And we'll turn it over to you, Dan.
Thank you. Is this on? If it works, I'll take it. Is this working? What if I just speak? How about that? Hello, hello. Mic is working. Oh boy. I've messed up a lot of mics in my life, but I won't take the blame for this one. This has to be a stress dream because I see 3 former bosses in the audience. I see Lee Sloan from APSIA. I'm going to try to forget who you are because I'm overwhelmed. I see John Dixon leading forward. This is an amazing gathering. I was told to try to create controversy today, but Tom Hull knows that I never do that. So what I am going to try to do is highlight. This is very, we're already finding some repetition. I think there is some like-mindedness in this room. We're going to see more of it, I think, throughout the day. I want to talk, just see if I can create some controversy, talking about what I call old think what I call new think. I think we have to make some reference, as we just heard, to the crisis that we all are aware of. We just have to factor this into our discussions today, the economics we're facing. And finally, to try to keep you willing to listen to me, I have a good Joseph Nye anecdote that I'm going to end with. I had a short talk with him a couple of months ago. I do want to posit that we've already started talking about public diplomacy, although that's not the title of this particular panel. But yes, higher education, public diplomacy. I'm going to propose that while these two things are very interrelated, they are not identical. Public diplomacy, I think I would define daringly and maybe too boldly as something that a government does to try to further its interest, or that a nation does to try to enhance its power in the world. Certainly higher education is one of the ways of doing that, but I do think it's important to see the difference between those two things. Now, anecdotally, we were told to, or Bob Gossendi gave the green light for anecdotes. It's 1979. I get a PhD in French. What do you do with that? Other than continuing your job as a taxi driver in Boston, you listen closely to friends who say there are no applicants for the Fulbright position in Brazzaville, the People's Republic of Congo. You apply knowing that there's no way of not getting that scholarship because you're the only applicant, and you become the Fulbright professor at Marian Gwabi University, which I was in 1980. And we all have great, I think we all have great Fulbright anecdotes, and I won't claim this is better than others. The meaning of, let's call this public diplomacy for a moment. I was zealot. I showed up at classes. My colleagues did not. The students at Marian Gwabi University learned very quickly. I never even thought about this or noticed it until halfway through the year. They noticed that the American professor always showed up to his classes. And this may be the only impression that I left in Brazzaville, but it was an impression. In addition, there was a great moment of insight. There was, at that time, the English department was completely, this is the People's Republic of the Congo, was completely in the Marxist school of interpretation of everything. Very bright, very wonderful colleagues. One of them received a Fulbright grant for the second semester, for the spring semester of the year that I was there, but never told anybody that he was leaving. When he left his exam on a novel of Bernard Malamud, there was no one to grade the exam. He had gone, he left. But Zelig here was present, and so I had a great insight because these were essay exams, and I got to read Malamud from a Marxist point of view. And I jotted down some of the things that I read. Here, this is a verbatim quote from a student's exam in the Congo. All and sundry consider righteously Frank Alpine as the main character in Bernard Malamud's book, The Assistant. The student talks about Frank Alpine is but 25. He spent a little part of his childhood in an orphan house. From Italian origin, the young boy has to face alone the struggle for survival, whereas the country where he is living is ruled by jungle law. Moreover, he is not a WASP, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Therefore, he is the victim of religious and racial animosity. He is the embodiment of the struggle led by all the oppressed people in the United States, the most powerful and capitalist nation, which is an animal organism in which money flows like blood in the veins. So I sent a photocopy, well, there were no photocopies. I typed out this exam and sent it to Bernard Malamud in New York. And he gave me the following answer. Here's his letter to me. Thanks for your charming letter. This is the year of the assistant as examination materials that's being used by the French in this year's agrégation. And now here's your letter with news from the Congo. I think the best statement I've read about my work. eloquent and unarguable, begins, all and sundry righteously consider Frank Alpine as the main character in Bernard Malamud's book, The Assistant. Otherwise, Malamud continues, the statement is not bad because it moves in the direction of the truth. I mean, this was a man with a sense of humor. I can say that the Fulbright experience changed my life a lot. That's for sure. I mean, everybody has an anecdote like that. I think it changed slightly the perception of Congolese students, again, because I used to show up. And then later, when I was administering Fulbright programs in the field as a public diplomacy officer, one anecdote, Bart Muz, a thoracic surgeon, was sent to Cameroon when I was PAO there. And I never heard of an MD working on a Fulbright. And in fact, this had happened, this had already been pre-cooked before I arrived. What can you do but meet him at the airport, make him feel comfortable? Bart Muz, a thoracic, his specialty was amputations. And he would go around to the villages in Cameroon finding people with gangrenous limbs and fingers. He did a few hernias while he was at it. He used to operate on people on the hood of his car. I think the sterile technique was more relative than absolute. And at one point, I asked him, do you have malpractice insurance? And he said, absolutely. Years later, I saw the policy. What it was a ticket out of the country. It was his plane ticket. So soft power, and this is going to get to the Joseph Nye story at the end. It seems that what we do is so much fun that why would a taxpayer pay for it? And this is where I see a distinction between higher education, which has intrinsic economic and intellectual basis, and our continuous effort to make governments aware that it might be worth their money. This is an argument I think we will never settle, and I think we all have an interest in trying to perfect that argument. Maybe we'll figure that out today. Let's assume that it is a positive outcome and that a government does have an interest in paying for this type of thing. Let's also admit, if so, that the Erasmus program in Europe is overtaking us. Let's admit that the Confucius centers are out there. The Goethe Institute, the British Council has been there. And what I call old think is the notion that this is part of a strategy. A strategy is a kind of thinking where you're trying to gain an advantage over someone else. And we've seen a lot of comment about this, about how soft power will enhance the position of our country in the world. This is a legitimate thought. Tied together with this, and we just heard the difference between cultural exchange and what did you call it, Mark? The truth campaigns. Yes, they are related. When, as part of the whole apparatus, you have something called the war of ideas, which is what we had under James Glassman. It begins to. Then we really have to make a distinction between education as a free exchange of ideas and soft power as a strategy to try to gain an advantage over an adversary. Now, I see this as old think. One last anecdote. When I was on the Africa desk during the elections, I think it was 2008 in South Africa, and we realized that over half the cabinet appointed by the new president were recipients of U.S. government grants. And I said this at a meeting in the African Area Office, and the response of the PDAS, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, was, so what? How do we know that this has done anything for enhancing American power? I had a smarmy answer, but I didn't have a real answer. I said, you know, I was not present during the debriefing of these individuals. Everyone laughed at that because it was a very painful moment. Legitimate question. It was no fun. I thought, well, it goes without saying. We successfully identified future leaders. We have engaged them in our cultural and educational exchanges. And I think it goes without saying that that works to our advantage. But the question was legitimately raised, prove it. And of course you cannot prove it. The M&E, the monitoring and evaluation, is not our strong point, and it never has been, and I'm not sure, maybe Rick Ruth can help us figure out how to do M&E. I think he is the person, if anyone can do it, who can do that for us. So, stick around for the afternoon. Thank you, Rick. And moreover, I can give examples. I used to be, before finding a real job, I was an interpreter in French for African international visitors, and the idea was to befriend them, to make them aware of democracy, and to be open to the American society. The one who most struck me as being amiable, funny, brilliant, and a great future leader, and I spent 30 days with him, was Laurent Gbagbo, who was later the ruler who had to leave Côte d'Ivoire after a very bloody civil war, and who caused a lot of people getting killed. So you can find examples, if you want to, of really bad things that came out. Now, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but many of us, if you've read John Brown's blog, you've seen an article. I'm not going to cite which article it is. It talks about intellectual containment, which I think is an absolute misreading of George Kennan. I think this is more antithetical than anything I can think of to the real George Kennan, borrowing his phrase, and then proposing something called strategic intellectual competitiveness. This is old think. The idea that ideas can be a way of gaining advantage over other people is, I think, what we have been laboring under for many years. I think we should grow out of it. I think that if I know something and you know something, we both benefit. I think it's kind of almost a childish and obvious conclusion. This is not a zero-sum game. If I bring something to your awareness, I lose nothing by giving the idea to someone else. So I do think that the old think, the idea that we used to be in friendly competition with the British Council, the Goethe Institute. Now we're not so sure about the Confucius Centers. These are all win-wins, all of them. When I was in Brazzaville, I had tons of time on my hand. I went to the Pushkin Institute because they gave free Russian lessons. I never learned Russian, but my gosh, this was an enlightened organization. I benefited, and this was during the Afghanistan war. I was not an employee of the embassy. I asked the PAO, he said, go, you have no obligation to follow U.S. policy. You're not an official. Went to the Pushkin Institute. They were most marvelous. We were gathered in a courtyard around about this size one day, and the director of the institute, this was in the middle of the Afghanistan war, the last one, and I said, Professor, I'm beginning to understand Russian a little bit. Where can I can't find it on the shortwave radio, Radio Moscow. Where do I find it? And I'm sure I'm going to butcher the sentence, but in front of all of his colleagues, he said, "Я не знаю, я слушаю только голос Америка." Okay, that was that, and this was an enlightened individual who understood, and in retrospect, I have even more respect for this guy, who understood that. Look, we all have quests of intellectual advancement. Our nations are in competition. Let's let some other people deal with the power part of that, and let's just be intellectuals sharing what we know. Now, you'd never guess who is doing this type of thing very effectively right now, and that is the Embassy of France. The new ambassador, François Delattre, had a conference a couple weeks ago on something called French and American Partnerships Among NGOs. My gosh, are they smart? The French have figured out that if they fund the type of NGOs, they're very unrelated. The database on death penalty, sharing experiences on water, developing social entrepreneurship. The French government figured out that their own public diplomacy would be very enhanced if they go into partnerships with NGOs that appear to be having a positive impact in the society. And some of the American participants in that panel were astounded at something they called NGO diplomacy. They thought, wow, the French understand this, and they're not being statist in the old French centralized kind of mindset. They are actually sharing things, and they understand, by the way, that governments tend to be pretty much near bankruptcy now, and what we used to call public-private partnerships are now obviously the basis of the future, because no one entity can fund all of this stuff. The crisis. We know, I have students, I wanted to remember, I don't have a PowerPoint, but I have a picture book. I teach at something called the Washington Semester Program. Students come for one semester only. They come from about 50% from other countries and 50% from different colleges in the US. I've been doing this for 4 semesters. The group that I have now, I was saying at dinner last night, there's something about them. They're wonderful, inquisitive, energetic young people, and I have the impression that they're afraid. I think that they're smart enough to know what they're up against at graduation. What we thought was a bad period of employment in 2002, 2003 is now considered the golden age. Tufts has recently brought the Fletcher School has brought a group of students to Washington a few weeks ago to look at presentations of possible careers. The students pay to go from Boston to Washington to have a look at these briefings. Guess what? They have to apply to be admitted as audience members to each individual session. There's competition to be in the audience in a session at a trip that you've paid for. The degree of competition, the degree of anxiety, I think, is going through the roof. Let me just say, I was really pleased to meet Bruce Silner yesterday. I don't know how you've done it, Bruce, but you have kept, somehow you've kept tuition in your program at New Paltz. You said something like $7,000 or $8,000. The Economist magazine is not a flaming left-wing organization. They say that American education, $40,000, $50,000 a year, could be cut by 2/3 if we had a greater look at middle-level management. Now, if you've read all the books on this topic that came out in 2011, it's very disheartening. I read only one of them, called The Fall of the Faculty, Benjamin Ginsberg, I think required reading for anyone in the room. The white-collar proletariat, he calls them. He calls he's very disdainful about mid-level management. He calls them deanlets and deanlings. And he says, as the Economist says, that this crunching the numbers makes it appear that this triples the cost of education in the United States. No wonder the Erasmus program is catching on. Europeans are very eager to go on the Erasmus program, and they would consider a Fulbright if there's not a better option. I think it was Krugman or somebody said the next bubble, we've seen the housing bubble, the next one will be student loans, and it's coming soon. So as I don't mean to imply we're on the Titanic here, but I see this very much on the minds, certainly of undergraduates. Graduate students who pay their way have to be thinking about this. This has to be part of what we talk about today. I promised you a Joseph Nye story. I met him a few weeks ago, and I said, Mr. Nye, I've always wanted to ask you, are you disappointed that soft power no longer exists now that Hillary Clinton no longer uses the term? She only calls it smart power. And if you've met Nye, he's the most gracious person in the world. And he laughed. He'd had the question before. He said, I understand. An American politician could never use a word like soft. It's just not feasible. It cannot be part of the American political discourse, he said. And moreover, smart power is big enough to include soft power. And that's my anecdote.
Next, Kevin Kinzer from University of Albany.
Thanks, Jason. As Jason says, I'm from SUNY Albany, and I work with Jason as a co-director of the cross-border education research team, among other areas. And so my background is in this area of cross-border higher education, in particular the development of international branch campuses. And I got into this area in a couple of different ways, but one way is thinking about it as an example of private education, an example of privatization of education, ways that countries are using non-governmental entities in order to fulfill their educational capacity. And turning to, in fact, universities, colleges, educational institutions that are, in many cases, funded and supported by governments from other countries. And what this ends up happening is these educational institutions become, once they leave their home government, once they leave their home entity, become, in essence, a private example. They are regulated as private entities. They develop private sorts of functions in terms of their demands for revenue generation and those sorts of things. And you have this odd, ambiguous sector relationship between public and private higher education, where institutions are maybe neither fully public nor fully private in the way that they operate across different geopolitical realms. And I think that's an important way of at least from my perspective, as I started thinking about this, and through the urging and unrelenting demands that Bob Gosendi gave us in terms of pulling us towards this topic, in thinking about it from that perspective, this idea that the public purpose, the public mission of higher education really needs to be considered in terms of this mixed dimension of which public is being served, whose public is being served by the institution, the home government, the host government, where is this interaction happening, particularly when institutions travel across these borders. In some ways that we think about this, these providers become divorced from their government sponsorship. And one way, and just taking a U.S. example in terms of accreditation, we think of our accreditation system in here as our quality assurance guarantee in some ways. Despite the debate about it domestically, internationally it's seen as a gold standard in terms of accreditation. What isn't really appreciated about this is we have a non-governmental quality assurance system in the United States. There really is no relationship between the quality assurance function that we have and the government, whether it's the state government or the federal government. In fact, even though accreditation agencies do accredit internationally, they have no authority to do so that's being given by the government. They're acting solely as private actors when they do so. So we even have a system of quality assurance that has a very difficult time crossing borders and crossing boundaries because this distinct relationship to the domestic audience is where it's most concentrated on. I should also say that my other area of expertise, my other life, so to speak, is in for-profit higher education, particularly domestic for-profit higher education. In the U.S., it becomes similar to the growth of private higher education more globally in terms of the way that it emerged, that it grew, the practical credentials involved, regulatory issues, being revenue-driven, market-serving, and particularly legitimacy. As Katie kept pointing out, this notion of legitimacy comes as a fairly important activity here. One of the elements about this that's interesting to me is for-profit education is for the most part a domestic activity. Right? When you think about legally for-profit institutions, they mostly emerge and are indigenous to the countries where they operate. Of course, we do have some examples of transnational for-profit companies, but they really are a very minor part of this operation. But within these countries, there are similar issues of oversight and funding and purpose that go on. And so when you think about the international dimensions there, it's a different sort of realm of how that that local indigenous domestic function relates with this other sort of entity of privatized education, for-profit education. And so I see the link between these two things in thinking about international higher education, particularly this notion of international branch campuses, this projection of physical presence into other countries, also has this similar sort of non-traditional conception of how education exists. It has a similar revenue focus in many ways, and in particular, it has a fairly ambiguous relationship with government in the way that government relates to its authority to operate. In many cases, the home country government has very little interest in this international projection, these branch campuses, whereas the host government may have a very intense expectation of what's going on, to the extent that they may actually be subsidizing these foreign universities. They may actually be incorporating the recruitment of foreign universities into a national education plan. So when I think about higher education as international actors, one of the things that Jason mentioned in his opening remarks was this notion of higher education becoming a multinational enterprise, a multinational college and university. And that leads to a sort of a potential analogy to a multinational corporation, right? The idea of a university becoming separated from its own country and becoming a truly multinational enterprise. And it's a seductive metaphor, but I think that there's some areas where it doesn't quite match and perhaps might be a little misleading if we don't think about it in a more complex sort of way. In particular, you have to understand that universities still are deeply connected to their home location, right? It would be as if we had a multinational Coca-Cola that was called, instead of Coca-Cola, it was called the Atlanta Cola Company, right? And that's how it projected its presence, and its authority came from being based in Atlanta, not from the product that it was serving. Or that we have the amusement park of Orlando, right, instead of Walt Disney, right? It's that sort of connection back to home and place that universities still maintain, even when they move into other locations. There's also the element that the public purpose of education is still fundamental here. Even with, as opposed to a multinational corporation, even in the for-profit sector, you still have this idea that the education is there for some public purpose, and that it's being funded or supported or endorsed by governments for some sort of larger purpose than simply a commercial exchange that's going on. As I mentioned before, cross-border foreign universities are often part of national plans. This notion of economic development and the use of universities comes in all the time. It's not a commercial transaction in that sense. And then finally, there's this need for government backing, and I don't mean government backing in the sense of subsidies and those sorts of things, but an endorsement, an implied or implicit authority to operate. Sometimes this is explicit, sometimes it's implicit, but it relates to what Katie was talking about in terms of the legitimacy. This government endorsement, this endorsement of legitimacy, comes because the market for education is imperfect. You don't have the ability to judge quality and judge the product that you're getting before you actually buy it. You have to buy and get the education before you understand how good the education may be, and sometimes that even takes years after buying it before you understand what the real quality is. Let me just conclude then with just a couple of quick notes about what I think about the topic here was higher education institutions as international actors. And I think about higher education institutions more specifically than the sort of the students or the faculty or the people that they're part of. And in particular, maybe foreshadowing a bit our next session on public diplomacy, thinking about some of the ways that I think about this enterprise. And the first thing is the idea of universities and colleges as being in many cases, incredibly multicultural organizations. In other words, bringing a bunch of different cultures together, and in this particular context, international cultures together, particularly in places where they are fairly monocultural in their activities. The comment that Mark had about Madison having the African language specialty, if you've been to Madison, that is a surprising location for such but it is an international element to it. We've talked a lot about how the United States or other countries project that that abroad, but we also import it as well. We also bring that in as well. I went and visited Troy University in Troy, Alabama, and if you've ever been there, well, you have to make a special trip to get there, let's just put it that way. It's really in the middle of well, I'd say it was in the middle of nowhere, but that's giving nowhere a good name. It is, but it's an incredibly international place. They have locations all around the world. They bring in delegations from other countries on a regular basis. It's an incredible resource in that part of the country for this international development. In fact, the state of Alabama actually uses Troy in its overseas economic development activities to recruit other companies and businesses to come to Alabama by using the example of Troy University as its international dimension. There's international student enrollment, faculty research collaborations, but of course we also have that danger, that worry in some ways that perhaps we're giving away the family jewels, that we're training our competition, you know, those sorts of elements that come in, particularly in public sector institutions. The second thing is the notion of an international brand value, that the brand of education often has a value internationally quite separate from what people might think about the country as a whole or those sorts of things. And that brand can have a lot of importance in different countries. I was talking with a potential student, a doctoral student that we are recruiting from Vietnam, who was talking about the relationship and the importance of having partnerships with foreign universities for universities in her country to be able to be seen as high quality institutions. Those connections can be quite important. And then finally, I think more directly in relation to this is this explicit projection of national value and purpose. Just like we have sort of the Peace Corps that does this, and Fulbright and those sorts of things, but education more generally does this in terms of, I mean, an obvious way of education for development. But also, I think the broader perspective of education is about cooperation and dialogue. That's essential to education, and that's also essential to diplomacy, essential to these sorts of relations, and I think that's a key element of it as well. We have, as Mark talked about, that neoliberal challenge to this relationship, but I think he portrayed it with the appropriate level of complexity here, because it's not like this is a current dark age to the old golden age prior, that we really have a complex relationship between what the purpose and aims of the university are in relation to these broader agendas. So let me just conclude then with with thinking about this session, and I think if we surveyed the room, because of so many different people here, we'd have 30, 40 different perspectives on why you're here and what you think this meeting is about. And I think part of that is to try to get all of those ideas out on the table and try to reach some sort of consensus about what it's about why we are here, what these different agendas are that we have. What are the expectations for higher education as international actors? How or should we be intentional in this rather than serendipitous in the actions that we do? And then finally, what's sort of the coherent message that can influence government agenda, as well as the university agenda? So it's an influence of the government as well as the influence of universities as they globalize. And I'll leave it at there, and we might have a few minutes for questions.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and thanks to the rest of our panelists. We just wanted to we've got about 10 minutes or so to open the floor for questions or comments if anybody feels so inclined.
Yeah, and just before we get into that, I want to think too about, we talked a lot about sort of the American perspective here, and I want to pick up on Daniel's comment of sort of, public diplomacy and government initiative in that, and sort of the idea that diplomacy comes from government specifically and not necessarily non-state actors. But outside of the U.S., higher education can be state actors as well. And a couple of recent examples I've learned about during the Soviet era, the Soviet Union funded a university with a specific purpose to bring at-risk students, as we would call them, low SES students, into Russia from developing worlds and then send them back home to be leaders. The whole idea was to bring them into their educational system, much like we do with Fulbright, and send them back home. And if you saw any of the WikiLeaks announcements, there was one in particular that caught my eye. During the Iraqi war and the reconstruction, Iran was very thoughtful in trying to develop an Iranian-based university in Iraq, because they wanted to influence the future development, and they thought they may not be able to do it politically because America was taking the lead there, but if they could do it educationally, it may have a longer-term impact with reconnecting Iran with Iraq. So I want to make sure that we also sort of broaden our horizon and think about the ways not just U.S. universities here can be involved in public diplomacy, but more globally as well. Taya's got questions. Here's the microphone.
Here we go.
Nick up here has one. Ray.
There you go.
Yeah, my name's Ray Kozlowski. I teach international relations in the political science department here at the University at Albany. I also have a joint appointment in informatics. My primary line of research is actually on the politics and the political consequences of international migration and international travel. But my question and comment don't go down that line, but rather to Mark Johnson in terms of this history, and then reflecting on some of the potential unintended consequences for universities as international actors. And the quotes and everything, it's just so much of what we're talking about here is really programs and activities that developed in the context of the Cold War with the Soviet Union and the struggle with communism. And I wonder how that relates to the past 10 years, and that is the global war on terrorism. And if you think about some of the potential unintended consequences and fallout for universities who do get engaged and do take federal money, shall we say, to become partners in these activities. And I'm just going to, since we're using anecdotes, reflect a little bit about my own experience at the University of Pennsylvania as a graduate student in the early 1990s, where I heard about trying to understand why there were so many conflicts within our department in political science. And part of it was there were some professors who were supporting, how should we say, research funded by the government to do certain things, and others who were vehemently opposed, and how the split was sometimes played out in the 1980s on, committees that dealt with graduate students. So, that was an unintended consequence that had direct fallout. And I'm wondering to what extent this is a consideration that we have moving forward. And you had the list of what's going on in terms of funding and declining, again, for area studies and Title VI, et cetera. But we also have funding from the Department of Homeland Security, Science and Technology Directorate. I think there's something in the vicinity of a dozen DHS Centers for Excellence to fund consortia. And for example, University of Maryland has one. It heads up the Center for Study of Terrorism. So to what extent do these shifts and these realities, again, change the way that, if you will, the internal consequences, the politics within universities today?
Thanks, Ray. Maybe we can collect a few questions from folks, and then we got Nick was up here. That question will go Kate in the back.
Thank you, Nick Cull. I wonder if you could comment on, well, something that really annoyed me in terms of misunderstanding what international education is about is the President's State of the Union address, where he mourned the fact that students go home after their education in the United States. I mean, what are we up against when the President doesn't understand the two-way function of international education and actually sees the function of international education as being a brain drain?
Hang on a second.
Hi, Kay Wilkie from New York State Department of Economic Development. So I'm not an academician. I work on the intersection often of federal and state trade policy issues. So I've worked a lot with SUNY colleagues on promoting New York State as a destination of choice. So probably I'm on the commercial side of this conversation. But I wanted to suggest, after listening to the panel and some of the brilliant historical perspectives, that one of the things that I think is true, certainly for trade policy, and I would posit for international education and public diplomacy issues as well academically, is the shift historically from the U.S. approach to whether it's trade or education as being a preeminent, dominant world power to one that is now more trade dependent, more internationally competitively challenged than has historically been the case. And I see this as a critical issue in trade policy. I think it's critical for us to think about this in terms of higher education as well. We are no longer the undisputed, preeminent, overtly dominant economic power that we were. And that means from a standpoint of trade policy, it's not just about how we position ourselves so that people can sell to us, which has historically been the framework for trade policy in this country. And we have to also think about how we frame the dynamics so we have more equal exchanges and more competitive exchanges as exporters. So just wanted to put that out there.
We've got Ray, and then maybe one more.
Ray Bromley, University at Albany. My attention span's not always good, so I may have missed words here and there, but there are certain things which I didn't hear and that I thought were very, very illustrative, especially in relationship to Mark Johnson's presentation. We didn't talk about citizen diplomacy as opposed to public diplomacy. No one spoke about tourism, I don't think, as a global phenomenon and what it does and what it means. Ethnic studies, to a large extent, have replaced, in some senses, foreign area studies. And there's a whole issue, a culture that emerged in the 70s, 80s, 90s of ethnic legitimacy. I come out of a Latin American studies background, so, but the thing that most struck me was looking into the future, computers, the internet, online education, and what is going to happen to all of our international activities because of technological change. It occurred to me, for example, that where in the old days we used to take a foreign language and foreign area studies specialist and get them to pore over thousands and thousands of intelligence reports, reading them one by one, line by line, piece by piece, listening in, interviewing, checking. Nowadays, we tell a machine to do it. And it checks, in fact, 100 times as much information in a few seconds as what one person used to do in a month. So the changing technology might have an enormous long-term impact on everything that we're talking about. And I'd be very interested in any of you speculating on that technological change.
Take one more in the back of the room and we'll open up the panelists for some brief remarks.
Hi, Tom Healy, Chair of the Fulbright Board. I was deeply impressed by the rigor of Dan Whitman's Fulbright application and competition process in going to Brazzaville.
Thanks for that.
But to that point, I would like to hear more in the coming sessions about the scope of what we mean by international education. We still have the challenge in Fulbright in many locations around the world where the engagement, competition, eagerness to participate is fairly lopsided, of Americans wanting to go to some places, or even the capacity to have American scholars and students, much less than the desire to come here. But then in terms of a number of American students coming to America from India, from China, vastly outweighing the numbers going there, still the major focus of American universities and American students is on Western Europe. And if Fulbright were just about to make some very significant cuts in the engagement of the Fulbright program in Western Europe, where we're forced to cut somewhere and the program around the world is increasing. We're doubling the size of the program in India and Pakistan, and we're starting a program again in Libya. So with those limited resources, we have to do something. But I'd be curious about how people are conceiving that engagement in American universities, because it does seem the participation is growing mostly in Western Europe as it goes from the United States, but increasing from the rest of the world as it comes here. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Why don't we turn it back to our panelists for some remarks on these, and we'll pull it together for a coffee break at the end.
Is any mic working? Any mic? Maybe not. I have a half a sentence per question, because I have an attention span issue also. Oh, this is working. Just to acknowledge the importance of every question that's just been asked. But here's my half sentence. On the unintended consequences, and Mark raised the issue, and I think you're going to have more of an answer to this than I do, but we also have not used the word credibility. It's mainly what we have. It's the greatest resource we have. Once we blow it, we've blown it. That's my half sentence on that. I'm not saying that we should question, look in the eyes of the donor and have absolute assurance that we agree with the donor in every sense. But we really obviously must be mindful of crossing that line. Once you've lost credibility, it's like virginity, you don't get it back. Second, the Nick's question about the Obama statement. I think maybe Rick can talk to this later. As I understand it, what he said, he talked the talk in that sense, but he has asked for a $20 million increase, I think. Maybe Rick can shed light on this. The exchange budget for ECA, at least the proposed budget for 2011 to 13, actually is going up. That doesn't mean that the Congress will approve it, but the administration, again, I'm really not the expert in this room, but as I understand it, of the many things being cut, and we've just heard about different priorities in the Fulbright program, at least the resources, at least the executive branch of government believes that this should go on. So I think this is a good sign. That doesn't mean that they're going to get their way once we have the budget battles coming up. So an increase, I think, of $20.3 million for Fulbright. It'll be redistributed, as we've just heard. Thirdly, the U.S. being more trade dependent. Sometimes I think of, when I hear this question, I hear it a lot. We don't have hegemony and we've lost it. And, you know, I'm not deeply disturbed about this. I think of a country like the United Kingdom, which after World War II lost its empire. Is the United Kingdom a country without influence? Is it a country that has not found a useful role in the world? Recently, Steve Clements in Washington had a public outbrief of the outgoing British ambassador, who put it so nicely when he said, we may not be the most important country in the world, but we actually have international connections, and we're glad to work with you on this. I think that obviously our role is changing in the United States. That doesn't mean it's disappearing. It means we readjust. And as I like to look at UK as an example of how to take a situation like that and to do pretty darn well. Tourism, yes, absolutely. And we know from public opinion surveys in Spain, where Americans are most disliked of any country in Europe, we know that the minute a Spaniard meets an American, the opinion is immediately reversed. So the surveys indicate that there is kind of a virtual and assumptive dislike, but as soon as there's any contact at all, we see that the depth of the dislike is in fact very shallow. And yes, tourism has had an enormous positive impact. I mean, when you think of some of the people you've seen when you are on tours and how drunk they get, you wonder why. But there is a positive thing. The classroom, someone told me recently, and just think about this, if the founders of our country came back today, they would not recognize subways or airplanes or even streets, or certainly not skyscrapers. What they would all recognize would be the classroom. Now, maybe that says this is a great tradition and we would be foolish to toss it overboard. You can read this the opposite way. You could say, this is so archaic. How could we still be doing this? We've modernized our country, and yet we haven't really significantly changed the way we transmit ideas. I think it's a fascinating question that you raised. I don't think anybody here knows how technology is going to supplant the classroom. There's no doubt at all that it will change. I still think, I'm pretty old-fashioned, and I see a few smiles, I feel that information really is transferred face-to-face, but we may not have the luxury much longer of doing it that way. On Fulbright, for example, as an instrument of foreign policy, I think there are people in the room very aware of this debate that takes place every year. It'll always take place every year. Is the Fulbright program an instrument of U.S. policy, or is it an instrument to promote academic intelligence in the purest sense? The truth is that it's both. And we've had really pretty strident arguments one way or the other. It should never be political. We should never sacrifice academic. Well, why do you think we're paying for it? Why does the taxpayer? These are legitimate arguments. I think the question has not been settled, will never be settled, because in fact it's a hybrid.
Great. We're running very short on time, but maybe 30 seconds for each panelist. I hate to be that short, but if you guys wanted to say anything.
Go ahead.
Just very quickly, because I also got the signal that we're supposed to cut off. The bigger picture, of course, if you think about, so we spend $700 billion on defense, 70, who knows, on intelligence. And we're really in the world of maybe $125 million total in Department of Ed for this kind of funding. Another, Fulbright is another, it's a travesty that our investment priorities are so skewed, frankly. On the data mining, of course, you're right. We can generate, rather than have thousands of people trained, in the Foreign Broadcast Information Service to translate all this documentation, we can generate this through computers. And yet all that's doing is mining out certain words as flags for counterterrorism and security operations. It is nothing remotely resembling the kind of deep cultural understanding that you have of people actually reading those documents, immersing themselves in that material, and then translating it into English. And the resource that provided those transcripts of foreign, television, radio, and print media from dozens of different world languages, the resource that provided for scholarship and for teaching in American universities was unparalleled. And we have lost that and many other things like that, I think, at our peril.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Kevin, did you?
Do I get my 30 seconds?
Yes.
Absolutely. I'm an academic. I rarely give up the chance to comment. Just real quick, just on Ray's notion of technological change, one of the things that I've said a lot is never bet against the technology. The technology has the ability to do amazing things. But technology, it implies a delivery. Delivery implies a product. And the form of the delivery defines the product. Language instruction is probably a good example here. So I guess the question would be, what sort of product is a virtually delivered international education?
Katie's good. Great. Well, I think a great panel to kick us off this morning and some great questions to propel our thinking into our coffee break. So why don't we thank the panelists for their great job.